Bob's going to make his way up to the front and has a presentation that will begin as soon as we have all of our stuff up on the screen. So if you're able to find a seat, he will take over in 3, 2, 1, 0.
Right, good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
So I hope in about 15 minutes to kind of go through some of the science behind the current pandemic to help you understand where we've been, where we are now, and why masking and social distancing guidance is changing so rapidly. So to begin with, we live in a world of viruses. Viruses are the most abundant life form on the planet. If you think of any living thing, plants, bacteria, or pets, us, there are viruses that are well adapted to infect that organism. If you look at all the viruses in the world, they're divided into groups called families. And just like human families, some are very small with only a handful of members, which are called strains, and others are huge with thousands of different strains. Among all the virus families, the coronavirus family is one of the largest. There are thousands of different flavors of coronaviruses that infect mammals of all sorts. If you think of a mammal, there are coronaviruses that infect it. The name comes from the fact that years ago, a virologist who perhaps had too much to drink looked under the microscope, looked at the virus, which is in the upper left, and thought it somewhat resembled the corona that surrounds the sun. Scientists think of things like that. So that's where the name coronavirus came from. So there are thousands of coronaviruses, and everybody here has been infected with them because there are 4, of all the strains of coronaviruses, there are 4 that routinely infect people. They're one of the causes of the common cold. So we've all had colds. You typically get a cold every winter. The cold is caused by viruses of different sorts. About 20% of the common cold is caused by one of 4 different strains of coronaviruses, but it's just a cold. Nobody dies from this. You feel uncomfortable, but you don't get really sick. And so for years, nobody really studied coronaviruses because they were not medically important. But that changed in 2002 when a new coronavirus entered the human population in Southeast Asia. It caused a disease that was called severe acute respiratory syndrome, or SARS for short. About 3 months after the discovery of this disease, which spread rapidly throughout the world through international travel, the cause was identified, and it was discovered to be a new flavor of coronavirus that had previously lived in bats and had made the leap to people. Bats actually transmit many viruses to people. About 8,000 people became infected, about 10% of them died, but the virus was eliminated not from a vaccine or through treatments, but by public health measures. And it turns out that people infected with this virus, which is called SARS-CoV for SARS coronavirus, only transmit the virus once they become symptomatic, which means that you can identify people who have symptoms and isolate them and prevent the spread. The virus that is circulating today, if you get infected, you start spreading it before you become symptomatic. So it is possible to suppress infection through public health measures. It is impossible to eliminate it. So that's SARS-CoV, and it's not been in the human population since 2003. It's still out there in bats, but it hasn't infected people. There's actually a second coronavirus that infects people, and it's called Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome virus, or MERS for short. The symptoms are very similar to what you see with SARS or with COVID. It too comes from bats. Usually it goes from bats to camels to people. There are about 2,500 cases last year, mostly in Saudi Arabia. But because this virus is well adapted to infect bats and camels, it's not transmitted between people very efficiently. So what happens, you have these little outbreaks and they go away. And another little outbreak and it goes away. That's usually what happens when viruses are transmitted to humans from some other organism. Ebola virus would be an example of that. So there's MERS. And now, unfortunately, we have a third deadly coronavirus that's made the leap to people, this time for good. So this is called SARS because the disease is very similar to the original SARS. There's some differences, but by and large, pretty similar. And it's caused, again, by a coronavirus that came from bats. Right? And so this is now called SARS-CoV-2, and that's the virus that causes COVID-19. which is an acronym for Coronavirus Infectious Disease from 2019. So the virus is SARS-CoV-2. The disease it causes is called COVID. On the right-hand side, I show a family tree of coronaviruses that infect bats. I show where SARS-CoV-1 and SARS-CoV-2 came from. They're in the same family, but from different branches within that family. So quite similar to SARS-CoV-1. So we've seen this before. The pandemic has been characterized by a series of waves, the most recent one caused by the Omicron variant that we're now rapidly coming out of. And so what causes this? When this virus entered the human population, it was not so well adapted to infect people. But viruses mutate and they evolve. That's what viruses do. This is why you need the flu vaccine every winter, because flu changes every year. Therefore, the vaccine changes. When mutations accumulated in SARS-CoV-2, creating a variant that was better able to infect people, that would cause a new wave. In fact, at the very earliest days of the pandemic, in early 2020, the first variant emerged that had a key mutation that enabled it to latch onto human cells more efficiently than the original virus that arose in China. The notable variants you may have heard of were the UK variant, which was last spring and summer, and that's now called the Alpha variant. Then the Delta variant came along. It was even better able to infect people. So we had that big wave in the fall, and that went away, and now the Omicron variant. And if you look at the upper graph, you can see that many, many more people were infected with Omicron than any previous variant. You can also see that the infection rate was incredible. I mean, this thing went from 0 to 60 in no time at all. The only way that this could occur is two factors. One, this virus has to be more infectious than any variant that preceded it. And two, we're in a very different place now. There's a high level of immunity in the human population, particularly in North America, due to vaccination and prior infection. The only way that this virus can infect so many people is if it exhibits something that we call partial immune escape. This virus has a series of mutations that lessen the ability of the immune response that we have from vaccination to fight the virus. This is what flu does. Every year flu changes a little bit, which makes our immune response less effective. So you get vaccinated again, but with a slightly different vaccine. So that has to be what has happened with this virus. So the Omicron virus is indeed more infectious. When SARS-CoV-2 entered humans in China in late 2019, unfortunately for us, it was just about as infectious and as transmissible as the great Spanish flu of 1918 that killed more than 50 million people. So it was already more infectious than flu. The Delta variant had mutations that enabled it to adapt to humans better, and it was about 3 times more infectious than the original virus, which is why that virus tore through the human population last fall. Omicron is more infectious yet. It is about the most infectious respiratory virus known. It is not quite as infectious as measles, which is the winner, but it's more infectious than virtually anything else, which means that going forward, there will be other variants that will arise, but when they become common, it's going to be unlikely due to them becoming more infectious. This virus is already about as infectious as it can get. So what we'll probably see are variants that arise that have mutations that dampen our immune response, just like flu. This shows a little bit of the science that explains why you should get a booster if you've not done so already. We can measure antibodies in our blood that fight this virus. So if you look here, the black dots on the left, this shows the ability of serum from people who've been vaccinated to inactivate the original virus. To the right, in I think green, show results with the Delta variant. The antibodies elicited by the vaccine did a great job of inactivating the original virus and did a pretty darn good job of inactivating Delta. But Omicron has a whole bunch of mutations that make our antibodies less effective. They're there, but they're at lower levels, unless if you get a boost. If you get a boost, shown in the red arrow on the right, you can see the level of antibodies that can fight this virus increases, but it's still less than the ability of these antibodies to inhibit the original virus, which is what the vaccine was designed against. You may be reading that and hearing that antibodies elicited by the vaccine fall over time, which is true, but that's always true. That's the way our immune system is designed. If I were to take blood from anybody here, I would find antibodies to measles, to mumps, to chickenpox at very low levels. Your immune system is not designed to produce high levels of antibodies forever in case if you encounter a pathogen. Instead, what the vaccines do is they prime your immune system so that if you encounter the same virus again, it responds very quickly. So what I show here, the little red thing, that's the first exposure, say the vaccine. In about 2 weeks, your body makes antibodies. And then they fall. That's what happens. But if you get exposed to the virus again, what happens is your immune system responds within hours or days. It responds more strongly and better. So your levels of antibodies to COVID may be lower, but your immune system is poised to respond quickly if you see the virus, which is why the vaccine may not do a wonderful job of stopping infection, but does a great job of stopping serious infection, stopping hospitalization, and stopping death. This is from the CDC. On the right-hand side, we look at deaths, and basically about 95% of people dying in the US from this virus are not vaccinated, which shows you the vaccine does an incredible job of blocking serious infection. You may get infected. I know many vaccinated people who've been infected with Omicron. Typically, the symptoms are mild. So the data show, thousands and thousands of data points, if you're vaccinated, this affords great protection from serious infection. That's what vaccines are supposed to do. It's a bit misleading to expect that a vaccine will absolutely stop you from being infected. If you get exposed to measles today, you'll get infected, but your immune system will respond so quickly, you probably won't have symptoms and you won't even know you've been infected. Same thing with this. That's the way these things work. The virus has changed in other ways. Today's virus, Omicron, is less deadly than the viruses that preceded it. And why is that? Well, it turns out that SARS-CoV-2 latches onto a protein on the surface of your cells called ACE2, but then it has to interact with other things. Delta and the original viruses really like to infect the lungs. That causes pneumonia, and that can lead to death. Omicron, that can infect your lungs, but it's much better adapted to infect your upper airways, which explains why it's so transmissible. It's replicating in your mouth, in your nose. You can cough it out more easily. It can still cause pneumonia, but is less able to do so, which helps explain why, even though so many more people were infected with Omicron than with Delta, the death rate increased only very modestly. So the virus is now different. It is less virulent. We also have, these were approved right before Christmas, the first highly effective antiviral drugs with horrible names, but that's the way it goes with drugs. Don't even try to think of the name. But the data show that if you get infected with SARS-CoV-2, with Omicron, and if you take these drugs within 5 days of symptoms, they're highly effective at preventing hospitalization and death. Prior to that, we had no specific therapies. Many more are under development. Because we are in a different place, the virus is less deadly, because we have high levels of immunity in the population, and because we have new drugs, simply counting the number of infections is no longer a good reflection of risk. For a year and a half, simply counting the number of infections in a community was a good indicator of severity. If you knew that more people were infected, you knew more people would be in the hospital, that more people would die. That is no longer the case, right? So as a result, the CDC, Friday a week ago, changed the way that they assess risk. they now take into account to a much greater extent the number of people who are hospitalized because of COVID, rather than people who are hospitalized for some other reason and happen to have COVID. When they did that, the risk level for southeastern Pennsylvania, including this county, fell from red, high risk, to yellow, moderate risk. This week, because of falling infections, we're now green throughout southeastern Pennsylvania. Risk is low. Therefore, the official guidance from the CDC is that masking in green and yellow areas, such as where we are now, is optional, that social distancing is no longer required. However, the virus is still here, it will always be here, and there are people who have risk factors who may need to continue to mask. A colleague of mine at work had a heart transplant 2 years ago. He's been fully vaccinated because he's immunosuppressed, his immune system has not responded. He's at risk. Fortunately, we have these drugs now, so if he gets infected, we have a way to try to save him. So masking is optional. I think we need to respect people who choose to continue to mask because, more than 1 million Americans have died over the last 2 years relative to the 2 years before that. So summary, Omicron causes pneumonia less efficiently than the Delta variant, which preceded it. It causes upper airway infection more efficiently than Delta, which means it's well suited for transmission. That's exactly what we've seen. Upper airway infection is uncomfortable. Nobody likes getting the cold, but it's not going to send you to the hospital, and it's not going to kill you. Partial immune escape by Omicron means that more people are susceptible to infection, including even vaccinated. But the vaccine still does a great job of stopping a serious outcome. And then we have 2 new antiviral drugs that are also now available and others in development, which means for those who are infected, particularly those with risk factors, we have new treatment strategies that we did not have just 2 months ago. In terms of predictions, and everybody's crystal ball is hazy, I think we can anticipate that this virus will continue to mutate because that's what viruses do. They're professional mutators. Some of those mutations will enhance immune escape, which will make the vaccine less effective. So the COVID vaccine will no doubt need to be changed to match the ever-changing virus, just like the flu vaccine. This year's flu vaccine is subtly different from last year's. Last year's was different from the year before because the virus is a moving target. We will probably need boosters at regular intervals, perhaps yearly. Clinical trials are underway to try to administer the flu and COVID shot vaccine at the same time. So it could be, in a year or two, it'll be recommended you get a single shot that has the flu vaccine and COVID vaccine co-formulated. New treatments will further reduce mortality from this, and like flu, SARS-CoV-2 is simply here to stay. There's no reason to think this will be expunged in the human population. This is now a human virus. It is mutated to adapt to us. So we're going to have to live with it. Everybody's going to have to assess their level of risk, particularly in the winter, which is when flu, parvovirus, respiratory syncytial virus, tear through the human population. And if you have risk factors, you'll need to consider, obviously, getting vaccinated, but continue to wear a mask as appropriate. But for most of us, the official guidance is, in this region, that masking is optional, and as is social distancing. It's no longer called for. And I think what you're seeing throughout our society is that we're coming to grips with the new reality. And you can see that Philadelphia's dropped its mask guidance, and that will continue in the months to come. It's going to take us a while to readjust, I think, because we've been so used to wearing these darn things. But these have saved thousands of lives. That's just a fact. It's not perfect, but more than 1 million people have died during the pandemic, and untold thousands have been saved through these public health measures. But now, different era. The virus is less deadly. We have drugs. We've got a good vaccine. So risk is much less than it was last year. And that's the last slide. If anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them. If not, that's okay. But... All right, the result. Okay. I'll say, the session decided to move towards, going away with masks next week, and then later that week, CDC changed their recommendations. So we're actually ahead of the CDC here.
thank Bob. He's the reason that our session and our pandemic task force have come to the conclusion that we can move to a mask optional status beginning next Sunday. And then the Sunday following that, fellowship hour will resume. All of this was sent out in a letter that was emailed to the congregation. It's also available on the website. If you'd like to look at it, at the very top of the website, there's COVID-19 updates. And you can see the most recent guidance, but those are the major changes that we're making. So mask optional status, and I believe all parts of the building with the exception of the hallways during school. Like when the preschool's in session, we're asking that if you're around little kids that are in preschool that you wear a mask in the building, but that otherwise, all other settings, masks will be optional. I believe that all of these little ribbons are gonna go away, and we'll be eating together by the 20th, so yay! Many thanks to Maria for guiding us through the end of that process. She's not here today because she's renewing her vows. So we miss her today, but thank you all. This has been enough worship for one day, right? So why don't we all socialize and enjoy our afternoon together.